Hey, so this is your lecture, part one of immunity. So stay tuned for part two and three, where we'll discuss a little bit more in depth into adaptive immunity as well as the inflammation component to immunity. See you soon. Welcome to our first discussion on immunity. And we're going to cover this in kind of three sections here. And we've kind of amalgamated the anatomy and physiology as well as the pathology that goes along with this. So we're going to talk about the immune system in a broad sense. And then we're going to kind of specify which between innate and adaptive immunity. And then our third lecture, we're going to focus primarily on inflammation and anaphylaxis and the associated pathologies that go along with it. So, like nearly everything in the world, we want to remain safe. But what is safe? And we build walls, we build doors, we have concrete buildings, and these are all to keep ourselves safe from pretty much everything. But what about from an invader that we just can't see?
Contact. This is the moment when infection begins. How does infection happen? You see the tiny shapes there on the virus particle's surface? They seem like random blobs. In reality, they are tiny keys, proteins that have evolved to the perfect shape and size, enabling them to unlock these receptors on the surface of this lung cell. Like a smile and a handshake, the virus deceives this lung cell and is welcomed in, where it will command the cell to make more virus particles.
So, luckily, we've actually evolved our own National Guard, so to speak, complete with its own specialty units. And actually, I call them special forces. These systems we call immunity, and there are essentially two main components to immunity. The first component is the innate immunity. The second component to this is adaptive immunity. So just like their names sound, innate, you're kind of born with, and adaptive, well, it's adapted through experience. But let's start with an overview of the immune system first. And if you think about it, there's numerous pathologies or pathogens in the world. And by pathogens, what we're talking about disease causing organisms. And these can be things like bacteria, viruses, for the common one that we all know, right? Fungi, even parasites, all can cause disease in our body. So it wouldn't be a stretch to assume that our body actually employs multiple different methods that fight off invaders. And these methods depend on a couple of things. One is the invader inside or outside the body? Is the invader inside or outside the cell? And thirdly, is it small or large? All these play factors in in how they get into our body and how our body's going to respond to them. So in immunity, just like in battle, we have this first line of defense. And many of the systems or components that are really not quite part of the immune system, but we do call them first lines of defense. For example, our skin. Let's use a different color. Our skin. And really, our skin with its cells, they're packed super tight, and the top layer is the crown or the stratum corneum, and then this essentially is a dead layer. And so, if a virus or a bacteria try to invade the cell and try and replicate itself, it can't really do it. It's basically tantamount to us trying to use a fax machine that's not plugged in. It's just not going to work. So if your skin gets damaged, our skin contains these little scouts, similar to what we call kind of like a force recon. In fact, I would actually say it's more of like a sniper than anything, and it contains these ability or this ability to find and kill invaders. But it makes really no discrimination whatsoever, and they eat whatever is not self. And we call those guys macrophages. We're going to talk more about these guys in a bit. Another component to our first line of defense is mucus, and we're going to talk about the epithelial later or epitheliums in another lecture. But we have this mucus, and mucus is really this. It's thick, sticky, and one component of it's actually quite acidic. And it does this in order to trap the bacteria, trap the virus or the pathogen, and in acid, it doesn't really have a very good environment to proliferate very well. And these are produced by specific cells in our body. And we have kind of two different names for them. And I'm going to talk about a different name in a little bit. But we call these guys goblet cells. So we call these guys goblet cells. And really, they're called that because they're actually shaped like a goblet, interestingly enough. And they kind of produce this mucus, and it makes it kind of like an acidic environment. And really, if we have a low pH, and this really kills microorganisms. Remember, we talked about low pH. What does this do to protein? It denatures it. So it denatures protein. So what's going to happen? Well, as we saw, we have our virus that basically has all these proteins on the outside of it. What's going to happen? It's going to basically make these inoperable, and therefore they can't grab onto the cells and invade them, right? So low pH is actually very, very beneficial to a safe internal environment. So just like acids in our body produces enzymes as well, and it makes inhabitation sometimes incredibly difficult for these viruses and bacteria and fungi and parasites. But all in all, while these aren't really directly part of the immune system, they do play a role in our body's defenses. So, what is the immune system itself? And we're probably kind of looking for a definition here. And really, it's an integrated defense system that's composed of tissue, cells, and molecules. So, if you're looking for a true definition of what immunity is. So, as mentioned earlier, we have two types, and innate and adaptive. And just like they sound, innate, again, we're born with it. We've already got this built into ourselves. So, it's innate. And then adaptive, which again is acquired through experience. Part of our innate system, we have these primary lymphoid tissues. And that's what we're kind of seeing here. Let's go with a different color here. That's what we're seeing here. Oh, God, that's even a horrible color. Maybe pink. Yeah, pink's a little bit better. All right, so these are primary lymphoid tissues. And in fact, it's actually the bone marrow that I should be pointing at. And this is where cells of the immune system are generated. And they're actually generated in the bone marrow itself. And usually, and really, virtually all of our cells in the immune system originate from here. Okay? And we actually call this hematopoietic stem cells. So you guys probably have heard about stem cell research. This is where it comes from. And these hematopoietic stem cells produce essentially immature immune cells. And what they do is they will travel from there, and they will mature either within the bone marrow itself, or they will travel to another area and mature there. And that brings me to kind of my next point. Where one specific cell actually matures and develops is in the thymus. So right in the thymus. And we have a specific cell that will travel from the bone marrow and proliferate within the thymus here, and that is actually your T lymphocyte. Okay, so if you think about lymph from the lymph system, cyte, cell. Now we have secondary lymphoid tissue, and this is where I was telling you about the change in the name from goblet. So we have our goblet cells, but we also call these guys MALT. And this stands for mucosal associated lymph tissue. Not crazy important to understand or know that term. Okay. The biggest one that most people will go by is goblet. And again, these are mucus producing cells that trap and engulf pathogens, and they're typically present in our respiratory, GI, and our urinary tracts. Okay. And then we have our lymph nodes, which we can kind of see in throughout our body here. And our lymph nodes are where pathogens in the body and tissues are encountered. And they're connected by these lymph vessels that are really just scattered throughout the body. And we're going to cover this a lot more in depth in the lymph system in another lecture. But know that this is a significant portion of our immune system. And then we have our spleen. Our spleen here is typically houses red blood cells, but it also houses our white blood cells as well, and allows them to kind of sit there in waiting, essentially. So the difference is between innate versus adaptive immunity. And it seems pretty obvious, but I mean, let's go through them anyways. So we have our innate, and then we have our adaptive. So in our innate side, this is typically very broad. Oh, my Lord in heaven. VROAD. They're very broad, and they're for pathogen associated molecular patterns. Uh, so they're broad specificity for pathogen associated molecular patterns. So PAMP kind of sounds like a song. I'm sure you guys know which one I'm talking about. Okay. On the other side of that, adaptive itself is actually highly specific. Highly specific. And it's highly specific for specific things called antigens. We're going to talk about what those are in a minute. Our innate system it typically responds in the same way with the same intensity each time. Whereas our adaptive immunity itself gets stronger and typically faster with each reinfection. And we call this immunological memory. And this is actually part of our primary and even secondary responses. And if we go back to our innate, this is a very rapid response. And this usually occurs, from minutes to hours. And this one already has cells built into our body and tissues, things like macrophages, and or recruited from the bloodstream like neutrophils. Whereas adaptive immunity itself is initially rather slow, and so we're talking like days for it to kind of kick in. But essentially, the cells need time to proliferate and mature in the lymphoid tissue. So if we were to compare these side by side, obviously we have an kind of an umbrella term, and this obviously would be our immune system. And then part of our immune system we have innate. And then obviously on the other side, we have our adaptive. Now these are also called a couple of different things. Innate, we will refer to it as non-specific immunity, whereas adaptive, we will refer to it as specific specific immunity. And from the non-specific side, we have kind of two components. The first one is we have barriers, right? We already talked about their barriers, and those are like our skin, our epithelial tissue, etc. And we also have inflammation. as part of our innate immune system. And the way I think about inflammation is essentially it gets the stuff where it needs to go. It provides an avenue for things to get where they need to go. Okay, so things like phagocytes, monocytes, etc. This is inflammation provides an avenue for them to get there. So if we think about innate and it's built in, it kind of comes with a purchase. Therefore, it's generalized, it's standard, and it has kind of standing orders to attack whatever. So the main cells that are kind of responsible inside the innate immune system are leukocytes. Leukocytes, and another it basically it's another name for white blood cell. Okay, and this is our main, and these are typically non-specific. On the other side, we have uh, we have our specific, and as we said, it's highly specific to specific virus, bacteria, or any other pathogen. And these guys, this one is what I refer to as our special forces. Okay. And these are troops that basically infiltrate our bacteria, our bad guys. And the primary cell that's associated with our adaptive immunity is our lymphocytes. Lymphocytes. Okay, so it's a type of white blood cell. Now, lymphocytes actually have two components to them as well. And again, we'll cover these in a lot more detail in just a minute. But they have B lymphocytes and it has T lymphocytes. Okay. Now, our B lymphocytes, or B and T lymphocytes, are essentially named from where they're made or proliferated. So B lymphocytes, obviously, in bone marrow, whereas T lymphocytes in the thymus. So it's not produced in the thymus, but that's where it proliferates. And that's how we identify the difference between the two. Now, our B lymphocytes are responsible for something that we've probably heard this term a few times, but it's called humoral response. Excuse me. Now, what that typically means is it's a response within the fluid. Okay, so within our vasculature itself. And it means a pathogen has not yet entered into the cell, or it still has some remaining soldiers kind of sitting around in the blood or the body system. Okay, so if you want to remember how humoral works, basically it's within the fluid, not the cell itself. Okay, and then whereas T lymphocytes, let's draw an arrow for here, these guys are part of what we call cell mediated responses. And what this is just like it sounds, it's response from the cells directly. Okay, and cell mediated means that it's going to attack inside the cell. So there's your difference between those two. Okay, so let's talk about innate immunity. And in specific, we're actually going to be talking about the phagocytes a lot more in depth. So we're going to talk about phagocytes. Now, if a pathogen enters a body, illness will occur. So we need that defense system, and we need people on the ground recognizing that. So we have what we call the first line. So we know this is part of our skin. The goal of the first line is essentially to keep things out. So keep the bad out. Okay. And this obviously, as we said before, is our skin. Skin. And that has oils, acids, it's super tightly packed. Nothing can get through the top layer, and the top layer itself is dead. So it can't even get inside the cell and proliferate if it wants to. We also have mucous membranes. Okay, so we have mucous membranes, and again, these membranes produce highly acidic environment, which makes it really impossible or inhospitable for invaders. And then we have our stomach acid. If you guys recall, our stomach acid has a pH of 2, which pretty much kills everything. Okay. And then we have our second line of defense. So our second line of defense is our inflammatory response. And what, as I said before, the inflammation essentially gets things where it needs to go. Needs to go. Okay. And the primary component is the phagocytes. These guys are responsible for initiating all of the second line of defense. And these are cells that basically eating cells. Okay. So phago means to eat, cells or sites means cells. So if we want to think about a phagocyte, we have this guy here. This guy is nice little nucleus. And phagocytes have these super sensors on them that are kind of act like radio antennas, if you want to think of it that way. So these antennas are essentially responsible for sensing the area around the phagocyte. And what it's sensing for, or what it's looking for, is this pathogen. Okay, so here is our pathogen. So it's looking for this guy itself, and it's surrounding itself, or it's looking for anything that really is not self. So once the phagocyte realizes or detects this invader, he's going to do a couple of things. First thing he's going to do is he's going to turn into Pac-Man, and he's going to allow the invader kind of inside the cell itself, right? Because it wants to get inside the cells. Problem is this is not a cell that it wants to get into. And the phagocyte itself is going to engulf this bacteria, and it's going to start releasing what we call lysosomic activity, or lysosomes, that are going to digest this guy down. So as it basically happens, what's going to happen next is our phagocyte is going to have this guy wrapped in a vesicle. Now, this vesicle itself is called a phagosome. So this guy is called a phagosome. Okay, so it's basically membrane bound. And what's going to happen is our lysosomes are going to become active. Okay, so we get lysosomal activity, and they're going to migrate towards this. And what's going to happen is they're basically going to bridge with the membrane that it's surrounding. So the bridge with the phagosome, and it's going to basically drop in all of its contents. So it's going to drop in its acid, its enzymes, reactive oxygen species, what have you, and it's going to start to digest that guy down. Okay. And it's going to digest them down into a couple of things. It's going to digest them down into amino acids and peptide chains, which is a protein. Okay, so breaking it down into its protein parts. So what's going to happen then is this phagocyte is going to do kind of an interesting thing. So he's going to take this phagosome, and once it's kind of all digested, he's going to take a component, one of the proteins in here, and he's going to attach it to another protein that's in here. And the protein that is in here that it's going to attach to is called a major histocompatibility complex. And there's two of them. There's complex 1 and complex 2. I'm not going to talk much about 1. I'm going to talk primarily about complex 2, because that is the one here that is going to do the next component. What he's going to do is he's going to attach one of the proteins to this complex. And this complex is going to end up on the cell surface, and he's going to kind of poke his head out. And then what he's going to do is he's going to take one of these proteins, and he is going to set it up kind of like a flag outside. So he's going to attach it to the MHC2, and it's going to present itself on the cell surface, on the macrophage surface. And it basically sends up this flag. And when other cells are traveling around, they're going to sense this antigen. So that's what this is essentially called. It's called an antigen. and they're going to sense this antigen and they're going to respond appropriately. So we have different types of phagocytes. We have neutrophils, we have macrophages, dendritic cells. This is not to be confused with nerves and dendrites. The reason why they're called dendritic cells is because they basically have these arms protruding off of that look like dendrites. And then we have antigen presenting cells, and those are part of neutrophils as well. But we also have basophils and mast cells. Okay, so these are all part of our innate immune system. Okay, so think of the immune system as this military kind of creating a response plan. So initially, there's this discussion that occurs, and it takes place in the secondary lymphoid tissue, and we know that as like the thymus and the lymph nodes. Okay, so they're basically having this discussion that occurs, and they're going to decide a course of action. Oops, COUURC. There you go. So they're going to decide a course of action. They're going to come to an agreement, and then once that agreement is reached on the best way to fight, they're essentially going to get the orders. Okay, and then we have our troops are dispatched. Okay, so just like a military response, and they're going to be a dispatch to the invasion site. Uh, the movie Red Dawn seems to kind of come into context for me here. Okay, so then what's going to happen is in practice, our cells need to communicate. So they communicate kind of in two ways. So here's our one cell, and one way that they communicate is molecules are presented on one cell, and on the other cell, it has a receptor. Okay, and this is typically recognized by other protein in their proteins themselves, and it's typically recognized by that receptor itself. And this is both reflected on the cell surface. So what's going to happen is they're essentially just they're moving around arbitrarily, and they're going to bump into each other, and that's how they're going to connect. Okay, they're going to be able to talk to each other that way. The other component to this is they talk kind of at a distance, almost like what you would call like a radio wave or through radio waves. And one cell of the immune system will release molecules. Okay, so he's got basically these vacuoles, and they're going to enter onto the cell surface, and they're basically going to spill their contents into the surrounding tissue. Okay, and these are basically signals, and these signals we call cytokines. And they're chemical signals. Okay, and on the other side, or the other cell, or the other white blood cell that it's trying to communicate with, has again those antennas, and that's going to sense these specific cytokines. And when it senses those specific ones, because that's what it's programmed for, it's going to activate, and then it knows what its response is going to be. Okay, which is to go to the site and kill all the badness. So let's talk about some of the cells of the immune system a little bit more in depth. So hematopoiesis, hematopoiesis is oops, I don't know why I did that. Poiesis. There we go. Hematopoiesis essentially means cell generation, and this occurs, as we said before, in the bone marrow. And stem cells are the progenitor of these cells, and there's these multipotent essentially means that they can become many types of cells. Okay, so these progenitors can become any type of cell that they or produce any type of cell they want, and these differentiate in one of two ways. They go the what we call the myeloid path, or they can go to the lymphoid path. And part of our myeloid path, we get erythrocytes. My God, I'm having a day. Erythrocytes and eukaryocytes, which is platelets. Okay. And then on the lymphoid side, and actually, sorry, part of this as well is cells of our innate immune system, which we're going to talk about in just a second. And the lymphoid side, we have cells of adaptive immunity. Okay. And we also have what we call natural killer cells or other lymphoid cells. Now, our innate immune system has specific cells. The first cell we're going to talk about is called a neutrophil. So this would be our neutrophil right here. Okay. So our neutrophil is responsible for phagocytosis, which is a major white blood cell immune system. Okay. So this guy is basically responsible for eating. Then we have our monophils. And monophils are also macrophages. Okay. So that would be this guy up here. So this guy is also called monophil. And these guys, again, also phagocytic. So they eat cells. And these guys are typically found in the blood and tissues as well. Then we have our dendritic cells. And these guys produce chemicals that amp up inflammation. Okay, so these guys are or sorry, no, my apologies. These guys activate T cells. They activate, confuse myself there a second. They activate T cells. They also activate B cells. Okay. They also are part of a phagocyte. They also are phagocytic. And the B cells themselves form follicular dendritic cells. And then we go to eosinophils and basophils and mast cells. So all three of these produce chemicals that amp up inflammation. So they produce cytokines. And now, more specifically, your mast cell produces two specific ones: histamine, as well as heparin, on top of the cytokines. This is going to be important when we talk about a few things in a little bit. And we finally have natural killer cells. These guys right here. So these natural killer cells basically kill infected cells. And think of them as military police. That's kind of usually how I think of or remember these guys. Now, neutrophils are fairly short-lived. They typically only have one half-life or a half-life of about 2 to 3 days. They travel around the blood, but they will leave the blood in if the infection is in the tissue. So they're typically blood-bound, but they will end up in the tissues, as I said. Okay. Now, monocytes. So monocytes are also travel around tissue or travel around via blood and leave the blood if the tissue is infected. But upon leaving the blood, these guys actually differentiate into something very specific. We've talked about them about 100 times. They're called macrophages. So monocytes eventually develop into macrophages. Okay, and these guys are long-lived. So phagocytic cells use what we call pattern recognition receptors. So these recognize pathogen associated molecular patterns. That's a big word, right? So we call these PRR. and their job is to recognize a specific pattern on or specific molecular pattern on different invading cells. So we call these pathogen associated molecular patterns, aka PAMP. And anybody know that 50 Cent song that I'm referring to before? Yeah, it's fun. Okay, so what happens is some pathogens become coated as well with a substance that we call opsonin. And these are also recognized by phagocytes. And one type of opsonin that we call is called complement. Okay, so this is actually a coating that goes onto the invader. Okay, so it's basically going to surround this invader. And if you want to think about it, what it does is basically think of sugar. When you pour like a sugary syrup over something, it makes it super, super tasty, or kind of addictive if you like sweets. But basically, what it's doing is it's making the invader super, super enticing, and really wanting to get all the white blood cells to really just attach and recognize this invader, and it basically it facilitates binding. So I want you to recall that once it's engulfed by a phagocyte, it binds a protein or a peptide chain to the MHC, which is then presented on the cell surface to be recognized by other immune cells designed to be recognized by the major histocompatibility complex. So, in addition to lysosomal damage and degradation, a phagocyte uses a couple of things. It uses reactive oxygen species, which we can shorten down to ROS. It uses nitric oxide, which we can simply call NO. It uses hydrogen peroxide. Yep, our cells do make hydrogen peroxide. And it uses hydroxyl radicals. So all of these specifically require oxygen to be present in order for the cell to create these to kill the bacteria or the invading substance. Okay. But it also uses two other components. It might use proteases or defensins. ENSINS. Defensins, both chemicals, and they don't require oxygen to be present. Okay, so let's talk about the cells individually. So our dendritic cells. Let's talk about our dendritic cells. And as you saw, they look like these guys that have a whole bunch of different arms kind of protruding off of them. Our dendritic cells are derived from hematopoietic stem cells. We know that. It's named due to the processes that resemble the dendrites itself. It'll show antigens. It shows antigens to lymphocytes. It's present throughout the body. It's initially phagocytic. It possesses MHC molecules, because we know that from it showing antigens. And it activates helper T cells. So now I said earlier that it activates T cells and B cells. It actually does that through the use of helper T cells. Okay, so it kind of in a roundabout way activates those cells. Then we have our eosinophils. So our eosinophils are just these large nucleated cells, and they're present in blood and tissues. and it releases major basic proteins. How about our basophils? So our basophils are very similar. They are also a very large nucleated cell, except a bigger difference here is they also have what we call granules kind of interdispersed throughout its cytosol. And basophils are present in the blood only. It releases, what the heck happened there? There we go. Got it. It releases histamine. It also releases prostaglandins and leukotrienes. It may contain heparin as well, and it plays a role in wound healing. So it does contain heparin. Now we have my favorite cell, which is the mast cell. Now these guys are just like the basophil. They have granules interdispersed throughout, and they're closely related to those basophils, and they're present typically in mucus, so mucosal linings, skin, tissues, so connective tissue, but they're not typically in the blood itself. And these guys, just like the basophils, release histamine, heparin, prostaglandins, and leukotrienes. And then finally, we have our natural killer cells. A little bit smaller nucleated. What these guys do is they seek out the antigen presenting cells, APC. We'll just call them APC for short. So the antigen presenting cells and kill them. That's their job. They also detect cancer cells, and they're responsible for controlling cancer cells. Now, they don't need prior activation or exposure to recognize the antigen. So no previous exposure. Okay, and it does secrete cytokines. It specifically secretes interferon and specifically interferon Y and tissue necrosis factor A. And these act on other immune cells and they enhance those responses. Now we have other cells of the adaptive immune system. We have our helper T cells. So these are the cells of the adaptive immune system. And as their name suggests, they basically help cytotoxic T cells or help activate cytotoxic T cells and B cells. Okay, so they activate T and B cells. Specifically, I'm going to say cytotoxic T cells. We have regulatory cells. And these guys suppress other cells of the immune system. So their job is regulation. Suppress cells of immune system. Then we have cytotoxic T cells. And these guys are like they are our snipers. They kill infected cells. They infiltrate and kill infected cells. So these are your secret agents. And they're kind of the adaptive equivalent to natural killer cells, if that makes sense. Or sorry, the adaptive equivalent to innate natural killer cells. And then we have our B cells. These guys are their primary and almost their main job itself is to produce antibodies. We're going to talk about this in a whole other lecture. And that, my friends, is the end of your first lecture.